I genuinely don't think that a war is going to justify these bunkers. I think it's going to be something a lot more sinister. Heaps of billionaires are buying luxury bunkers these days. It's been all over the news. It first came out because Mark Zuckerberg bought or built a bunker in Hawaii.
What does Mark Zuckerberg know, and why is he building a $270 million compound in Hawaii?
It makes you wonder, what is it that these billionaires know that the rest of us normal people don't?
If there's enough smart people, they should be investigating this. Some speculate, this totally conspiracy, that like the powers that be know something's coming, and so they're just going to keep things going until then.
So in this video, I want to walk you through some theories that I've come up with from discussing this with friends and family and people in my network, but also just from reading things, consuming content from people in foreign affairs, international relations, geopolitics, etc. And so I've just come up with a few different theories that I want to go over with you in this video and start a little bit of a discussion, because I find this really interesting. 10 years ago, if someone had said that these rich and famous were building bunkers, many people would be calling them crazy, but today it's not so crazy. I mean, ever since the pandemic, I mean, can things really get crazier? Probably. It just has shown me that whatever happens in this world, I mean, nothing is for certain. Anything can happen. So I think a lot of people are on board with this. I think a lot of people do believe that something big is going to happen. The question is what? What is it that these billionaires know that we don't? So in doing all of my research and speaking to, a bunch of different people, I've come up with a few different theories that I want to go over. The main one that I think people are on board with is that there might be a world war. World War III is always on the cards according to the mainstream media. But if I really look at the current global situation, I'm not sure if that's really the case. Most of the Western media will tell you that Russia is a threat, or that China is a threat, or maybe Iran or North Korea. And perhaps the biggest threat really when it comes to these countries is a nuclear war or a nuclear conflict. And that very well might be the case. But if I really think about it, and by the way, I'm not an expert in this, this is just a theory, I don't see any of these countries launching a nuclear missile at anyone else. The main reason for that is because the West, particularly the USA, has more than enough nuclear missiles to fire back. So it would just be a lose-lose situation for everyone involved. I mean, the entire world would lose because it would destroy the world. So unless some crazy nutcase gets in power, who really does have a death wish, I can't see a nuclear conflict being the reason why these billionaires are building bunkers. And even if there was a nuclear conflict, do we really think that a bunker is going to save you from a nuclear war that could potentially destroy the world? Doubtful. So let's remove nuclear conflict from the equation. There's still the case or the possibility of a major war. And again, the mainstream media will tell you that the chance of a conflict with China is very high, or the chance of Russia invading further into Europe is very high. And maybe Iran or North Korea could do something, but let's be honest, Iran doesn't have the capability to engage in a war outside its general geography. And if it did, all those trade lanes would be shut down. And I just think it would be a suicidal mission for Iran to do something like that at this stage. Most likely, Iran will be engaging in warfare via proxies. That's typically what Iran has been doing for, the last 100 years. They just use proxies in different countries to cause chaos. They're very good at it. But can I see them invading another country, invading the West, or doing something large enough to justify bunkers in places like Hawaii or New Zealand? No, not really. North Korea, on the other hand, well, there's not that much information on how the country operates. They're very secretive. I know the leader of North Korea recently said that the chance of reunification with the South has passed. It's impossible to do. But the North Koreans, I mean, look, they just want to fight everyone, so the media says. They're sending missiles over to Russia to help the Russians engage in warfare over there. And whenever something happens, the North Koreans always want to launch a test nuclear device in the ocean. But we've already eliminated the idea of a nuclear war. So without nukes, is North Korea really a threat on the global scale? Probably not. They might do a lot of damage in South Korea and potentially in their near region. So Japan is also another country that could be affected by a war in Korea or on the Korean peninsula. But does it justify bunkers? No, I don't think so. Really, when it comes to a world war, the big contenders are Russia and China. Now, with Russia, they're bogged down in Ukraine. I think we've seen what they can do in Ukraine so far. It doesn't look like they're going to be getting past Ukraine, to be honest with you. I know the West has been funding the Ukrainian war effort, and if you want my honest opinion, I don't think Ukraine can win this war without the West's help. I think that Russia's going to get bogged down in Ukraine for a long time, for many years to come. The Russians probably know this, but they don't really have a choice. They're going to be bogged down there until something changes. Now, I'm no military expert, but I do know if your country is bogged down in a military conflict, and for many years, it's going to affect your economy. So that might have an effect on the government in Russia, could have effect on, the way the country operates. If Russia as a whole breaks down because of this, then that could have a significant effect on the world. Then you would have nukes in the hands of potential terrorists. I'm not saying that the Russians are terrorists, but if there's no government controlling a country, you're going to have warlords and things like that. They're going to have their own militias. If they get hold of nukes, well, who knows what can happen. I think it's quite a far-flung scenario. I don't think it's going to happen, but it is something to consider. And there is a possibility that might lead to the demand for bunkers. Because if there's a lot of warlords running a country, then it's just chaos and very hard to manage. But do I think that that's going to happen this year or next year? No. I think that if that is going to happen, it's going to happen over the next decade. But if I'm honest with myself, I don't think it will get to that. So then we've got China. Now everyone knows China is a major power. But based on what I've been reading, based on the knowledge that I've got from people much smarter than me in this area, the Chinese military is only land-based, really. They can only defend China. They don't have power projection capabilities. They don't have a blue water navy or a blue ocean navy. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, it means at its core that China cannot project power past the first island chain. So they can't really project power past Taiwan or past the countries just after Taiwan. So if there's a major war with China, the first thing the West is going to do is shut down the sea lanes around the Malacca Strait and in the Indian Ocean. So once those sea lanes are shut down, China's not going to be able to get food, supplies. It's going to be very tough for the country to survive. Now, the Chinese government are not stupid. They know that if they create a war, if something happens, that those sea lanes will be shut down. The US doesn't even need to be near China's border in order to do this. So you could essentially shut down China without firing a shot. So knowing this, it's very doubtful that China's going to invade Taiwan anytime soon or invade any other country anytime soon. And even if it was, even if this did happen, even if the sea lanes did get shut down, would China really be willing to launch nukes at the US? I guess it depends on how crippled the country is. If they can't get food into the country, if they can't get resources into the country, that's a lot of people that could potentially die. So only under those circumstances would a nuclear war be a possibility. But those are very dire circumstances, and I just can't imagine it happening anytime soon. So that scenario, in my eyes, is a non-possibility this year, and not the reason why these billionaires are building and buying bunkers. Now, there are two scenarios that I feel are the most likely ones that could happen this year or next year. And these scenarios are ones that I've really thought carefully about. I genuinely don't think that a war is going to justify these bunkers. I think it's going to be something a lot more sinister. Yes, World War III can change the world, but I think what is going to happen, or at least what these billionaires are possibly planning for, is something that we haven't seen before. So let's talk about these scenarios as A and B. And A is the one that I really think is going to happen, and B is a very close second. So let's start with scenario B. We've already seen how a pandemic shut down the world and the effects of that. I think it's very possible that there could be another pandemic that might be far worse than what we've seen in the past. The fact that this virus came from China and nothing has happened to China and there's been no investigation tells me that this is a very real possibility. But this pandemic showed that people can be easily controlled. It showed that the world will shut down to try and protect populations. It showed that it can cause fear and it can change the way people behave. It showed how tribal humans are. And so I believe that the next major thing, scenario B, the second most likely event, could be a more deadly pandemic. Imagine a pandemic where people are dying in the streets. I mean, that's enough to cause widespread panic. Even if it wasn't super deadly, if it caused enough panic, you'd see looting, rioting. I mean, these cities would just be unsafe for the average person. Not just because they could potentially die from this new pandemic, but because of other people creating a danger. And so this pandemic might be used to change the US elections. It could be used to control countries. It could be used to shut down or destroy countries. Who knows? It really depends on who created the pandemic in the first place, assuming that it was created by an organization or a group. So that's scenario B. Perhaps there's going to be a future pandemic. But what I really think is that there's going to be a scenario A, which is potentially much worse. Now, 2024 is an election year for the US. And for the last few years, the US have been dealing with President Joe Biden, who somehow managed to become president despite not knowing what room he stands in most of the time. But the reason he won is because so many people in the US supposedly hate Donald Trump. And so most people voted for President Biden because they would have preferred to have anyone beside Trump. Now, unfortunately, in the US, this has caused even more division. There's already enough division in the US between gender and race. The political divide is making that division even greater. And so based on what I've been reading and what I've been learning from some of these experts, is that if Joe Biden remains in power, him and his cronies are going to be going after Donald Trump and potentially arresting him and sending him to prison. But these experts also say that if Donald Trump gets elected, then he might go after the Democrats. He might use the FBI, the IRS, the CIA to go after these people and potentially arrest them and imprison them.
There's so much more at stake for these leaders in this election. If Biden loses, he and many of his closest advisors believe they will face legal jeopardy themselves, because Trump will work to politicize the IRS, the Department of Justice, the FBI, and use them against his opponents. Where if Biden wins, Trump faces jail.
And therefore the same result's going to happen. Half the country is going to be in uproar. Because this doesn't look like a democracy to me. The US has always been a champion of democracy. But over the last few years, from what I've been seeing, the US is not a democracy. It's something else. And I read recently that the US actually was downgraded from a democracy to a new thing. I'll put it on the screen for you. But they've been nominated this new form of government. And there's a few reasons for that, which again, I'll put up on the screen. But none of this seems like a conspiracy. None of this seems like it's too far-fetched to happen. And because of all these divisions, because of all this hate, because of all this craziness that's happening over in the US, I don't think it's out of this world to think that maybe that country might have a civil war sometime in the future, perhaps even around election times or after the elections.
The United States is not a well-functioning democracy.
And for those of us familiar with history, we know that the US Civil War was bloody. A lot of people died. But one can only imagine how a civil war would play out today. The population is far greater. There's far more guns in the country. One could argue that the division is greater. And so if what these political champions are saying is true, and either one of these people gets elected and goes after the other, we could be seeing a real US Civil War, which would affect everything around the world, from global markets to the safety of trade. And if the US is bogged down in a civil war, there's absolutely no way they're going to be helping other countries if they get invaded. And that will be the chance for these countries to strike. China would then have the capability to invade Taiwan and potentially go outside of that first island chain. Iran would have the capability to ramp up its proxy wars and maybe invade the countries around it. Russia could launch an even greater invasion of Ukraine, overwhelm Ukraine, and then go into the heart of Europe. Without the help of the US, the Europeans are going to struggle. And this is going to create a huge power vacuum. And the only way I see any of these things happening, the only way I see a world war potentially happening or these countries invading others, is if the US is bogged down in its own thing. I read a book by George Friedman who predicted that the US will eventually withdraw from the world. And he argues that the US is very self-sufficient. It's got all this energy, it's got enough food, it can trade within its own borders. And of course you've got Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. They have the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so if the US does decide to withdraw from the world, the country could sustain itself through that North American Free Trade Agreement without having to deal with the craziness out there in Asia or in Europe. And I think if that happens, it's going to be a very different world. And I think that is the most likely scenario that I could see happening in the future. And I think it's the one that these billionaires, these rich and famous, are potentially planning for. Whether it's going to happen this year or next, I think it is the most likely one. So let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like I said, all of this is just theory. I'm not an expert on anything. I have consumed a lot of content. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe some of the things I've said seems crazy to you or far-fetched. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.